Hello, welcome back to a new video. Today we shall talk about religion. Now, sorry for lacking a video yesterday. I was sleepy, and so I missed it. But today I'll make up for it with two videos, hopefully. So, in regards to religion, that's a fairly basic concept, essentially theism. And spiritualism would fall under the idea of religion. One is worshipping divine beings, the other is spirits, and spiritual practices in general. These together form the basis of much of religion. Now, if one wants to expand the definition, then go on ahead, but for the basics, we'll just talk about these two. Now, religion plays an interesting role in society. It has been called the opiate of the masses, but I don't think that'd be very accurate. Rather, religion is basically the guideline of the masses. Faith in general is. But where religion is special is that it, instead of just making people believe in, say, God, it can also make them believe in ideas. For example, the mere idea of the leader of the underworld being evil comes from Christianity, specifically Satan. Because a lot of people like to split the underworld into good, for Christians that'd be heaven, bad, for Christians that'd be heck, and neutral, that'd be purgatory. And so people like to imagine, oh, the God in charge of this is the good one, and the guy in charge of this is the bad one. That's not how Christian theology actually works, at least fully, but, it can influence it a bit. Furthermore, it makes things complicated when you look at other religions. For example, in Christianity, this is generally how it's broken down, but the ruler of all the underworld in Greek mythology is Hades. He is just the leader of the dead. So for a lot of Christians, it can be very weird to think about Greek mythology and specifically their underworld with this mindset. It's like learning a new language, really. You have to convert it to the understanding of that religion. Now, naturally, I know the Abrahamic religion's a bit better than the others. Not necessarily the best with any of them, but still. And so, generally, I see through an Abrahamic lens, despite not believing in it. As a result, I'm much better with... Excuse me for a bit while I try to draw. This ain't gonna be too good, but I can try. I was trying to draw the Star of David. I don't think I did too well, but it works. So, let's just say that's Judaism. This is Christianity. I believe some people draw it as a fish, but nah. And for sake of ease, this is Islam, since a lot of people recognize the moon and the star with the Muslim faith. Now, these are the three main religions of the modern day, really. This is for a number of reasons. For one, the Jews are basically everywhere. Following the diaspora with the conquest of Jerusalem and the rest of Israel, they ended up going through most of Europe and eventually Europe's colonies. Thus, they have a strong presence even outside of modern-day Israel, which is their nation-state. They get a lot of Jews in America, Europe, just generally throughout their colonies, and even in Asia to a few extents. It's not that big, and it can vary depending on where you are, what branch of Judaism they follow. But still, it's a relatively close-knit community, and it's a very interesting religion overall. Christianity is the largest religion on the world stage, and just in general. They spread through Europe following the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and his apostles, and proceeded to spread throughout not only Europe, but also Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Australia. This is largely through colonization, though with some places like Korea, it spread through missionaries. Then there's, of course, the Philippines, which was, colonized, so that kind of made it easier for them. Now, there's missionaries still going around today. In fact, it is a big belief of the Christians to proselytize. So, I'll break down Islam and Christianity down here because I know them a bit better than I would say Hinduism. So I'll break them down a bit, just for the sake of ease. But for Christianity, proselytizing is very big. I probably butchered the spelling, but the idea of basically go forth and spread my word is built into Christianity. As such, a lot of Christians take up missionary work. The Mormons especially do it, where they will go out and do outreach, attempting to spread their beliefs. Now, the Mormons are weird because some don't consider them Christian due to the fact they don't follow the Trinity, which is a Christian belief that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all God, but are not each other, and they're not separate parts. It's not my thing. I'm not going to go too in depth on the Trinity, but it's a thing that a lot of Christians believe. I'm not a Christian, so I don't. But still, it's a big deal in Christian theology, and I'm not touching that with a 6-foot pole. Another big thing for Christianity is, of course, interpretation. Now, a lot of belief systems, especially big ones, have interpretation as a big deal. Not to the same extent. For example, Confucianism generally encourages conformity, so interpreting things differently isn't really that big of a thing for them. But for the Jews especially, discussion of different parts of the Bible, or for them the Tanakh, is very important. Now, for the Christians, interpreting the Old and New Testament is important because, unlike the Jews who just discuss it and try to make notes basically what they think God believes, Christians try to basically nail it down. Okay, this verse says this, therefore God must have meant this. Or, okay, this verse means this, therefore God must have not meant that. Trying to essentially interpret God's word and assume what Christianity should follow. It's why there's so many different sects, because they disagree over even the most minute details. And say, alright, we don't agree with you, we're clearly not part of your sect, so we're going to go and do our own thing. That's why there's 2 different types of Baptists. Well, that and slavery, but yeah, let's not get into that. Another interesting thing about these 2 religions in particular is how they were founded. Well, Judaism is a cultural religion built around the Hebrews and their culture, which spread to their descendants, even though they don't always have a fully Hebrew blood. Christianity was spread by a man, Jesus of Nazareth. This characterized how it was to be interpreted later on, because Jesus would often say things that would go against established cultural norms or against beliefs of roles at the time, but people still followed him and treated him like a prophet. As a result, Christianity was basically the common man's religion. You would adopt it usually with the nobles first, but it was not far behind that the people would start catching on and adopt it as well. This is not mentioning, obviously, the many, many adoptions of Christianity while the Roman Empire was still suppressing them. And another big thing for the Christians is holding on to faith and being born again. Now, both of these have roots in the Bible to some extent, but where Jesus suffered, at least the Christians believe he suffered in their name, so too do they suffer and hold on to their faith strongly, doing essentially what they believe God did for them. Meanwhile, there's a quote about being born again, and that is carried over to a lot of Christian movements, especially in the modern day, which is the idea of, if you commit a sin, be born again and adopt a new role, being a Christian and being a good person. Of course, the born again movement and the evangelicals take a different route slightly, but still, same principle. Then there's Islam. Now, Islam mostly focuses on just ruling. and implementing its laws in terms of actual physical, legal context. It's why Sharia is such a big thing. Because Islam was invented by, a ruler. And I say invented as in, it's the one who proposed it to the people. All religions will usually argue that it wasn't invented, they were just finding God's word and spreading it to the people, but in terms of function, they basically made it. And so, it was spread by a ruler, which characterized how it would be interpreted. It's why law is such a big thing for Islam as an entity, and why just a single group, like, say, the Saudis, spreading their version of Islam is enough to cause a mass shift. Because if it's a matter of rules, and the people making the rules adopt a specific sect, well then guess what? That's going to be the sect putting things in place, including the law. It also involves interpretation, but to a much lesser extent. Since when you're dealing with Islam, you're mostly dealing with what school of thought. There are already schools of thought, people just generally adopt one of them. Can't go into them too much, mostly because I don't know the exact schools, so I can't devolve into Islam more than I know, because that would be basically lying, so this is largely skinning the surface. I know more about Christianity because that's what I grew up around. But the very nature of it being made by a ruler characterizes much of how it was practiced. For example, taxation. Do you know why taxes are such a big thing? Well, for the ruler, it's fairly simple. You need more money. What better way to placate your people while simultaneously getting rid of excess wealth from competition than having them donate it to the poor? And if they don't want to do it voluntarily, well, you got soldiers for that. Making it part of your religion makes things a heck of a lot more efficient. And so they have this weird mix of charity, but also discrimination. Since it is by law that you are to give up your excess wealth in the name of others, there will be discrimination if you do not do so. Furthermore, if you are a person who is not of the faith, it is common to raise an extra tax upon them, and furthermore, to ban you from military service. Now one might ask, well, why is being banned from military service a bad thing? It means you can't get out of the tax. You have to pay every other normal tax everyone does, but you also have to pay a tax for being a non-believer, which already stings. And you're not allowed to fight so that you don't have to pay that tax. Not always a fun time. Not to mention, there's the whole polygamy thing, which was common in Islam and may still well be common in certain parts of the Muslim world even now, where it was acceptable for a man to have multiple wives, for them to basically have no agency, and for them to be stuck inside. Now, because Christianity was spread by a human, that was not something that held on as much sway. In some societies, it slowly evolved out, but with Islam, because it's based on rules and law, such things were enforced far longer and even still maintain sway today. So when you hear of the Amish and their tendencies towards their women, it's somewhat bad, but frankly, I'd say Islam's got them beat in terms of the tyranny department. But what matters for all these is, as I demonstrated, even closely related faiths have notable differences, both derived from who they came from, but also how they interpret what is in their holy books or belief systems. For example, the Hindus with the Vedic texts have a bit more than just the Bible, Quran, and the Tanakh. But how they interpret things, including the caste system and the gods and how everything works, massively changes how it affects their culture. Same thing with the Confucians, the Taoists, and so on and so forth. But what's really important is religion is not inherently bad. With religion, there are some gives and takes because it depends on the faith and what they believe. For example, Christianity can be discriminatory. So can Islam, so can Judaism. So can every religion, really. But what's important for these faiths is how they unite people and what good things they do spread. Because when you have people who are bad at understanding why something is moral, just having a God said it's right can be very useful. And there are plenty of people who do not have a good justification for why not to do things outside of some authoritative justification. Religion provides a great one because it goes without any border. There can be no argument of, oh, well, the state says this is what we should do, and just following that. It is, well, this religion says you should do this, you're a believer, and it doesn't matter what country you are under. For example, just because your country says, alright guys, taking a woman and marrying her by force is perfectly fine, if your religion says that it isn't, number one, you're not likely to do it. Number two, it refrains from a lot of people doing immoral actions, even if the state supports it. That was actually a very big thing for the Christians when it came to Rome, was they felt that certain things the Romans practiced were not acceptable. Mainly paying tithes to other gods and being forced to in public ceremonies. How important was that? Debatable, but for the Christians it was a very big no-no because of the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt put no God before me and all that. And so religion allowed for a level of restraint that is very useful, especially when dealing with other taboos. For example, drinking to excess, or just generally consuming in excess. Engaging in lustful behavior. Treating people like property. Religion has been justified and used to explain why all of those things are bad. Simultaneously, people have used things to justify why they're good. Said people in the latter camp are wrong, however. And religion generally does not support that because it exists, to some extent, as a mean of guiding the masses to make sure they behave in a way that's societally effective. It's very useful in that regard. Those who cannot justify morality through natural rights and other such things usually need an authority to turn to. Religion is one of those. No one might say, well, why shouldn't the state do it? Would you honestly trust the state to say what's right and wrong? You could barely trust your neighbor with such a responsibility. Why would you trust the very entity that benefits from you following, regardless of if it's moral or not? Just a thought. Now, admittedly, religion has been used for horrible things. For example, it's justified discrimination for many, many years. But simultaneously, it's also very effective at justifying moral causes. For example, did you know that slavery of Christians was ended because the Pope decided to declare it illegal? That's right. Slavery was partially abolished by the Pope. Corporatism, even though I don't like it as an economic system, was also established by the papes. Not the papes, the popes. The papacy, there it is. The papacy encouraged people to work together as basically collective units so that people would be taken care of. In other words, the corporate state originates from religion. And we see with totalitarians, religion is often one of their biggest threats. It's why, for example, in Italy, Mussolini effectively tried to puppet the Pope, signing a deal that allowed the Vatican City to exist in exchange for them being silent on what he does with Italy. It was his way of basically neutralizing the Pope's power, because if the Pope said, Mussolini is a bad guy, you should remove him, a good few Catholic Italians would have actually listened. The Nazis did the same thing, neutering or heavily controlling what the religion in their borders were allowed to say. And the Soviets, of course, had straight-up purges because they were state atheists. Now, with all this said, it should be noted that generally religions do not exist well together. For example, take India and Pakistan. Admittedly, they'd probably work better if Britain didn't divide them in a very horrible tribalistic way. Frankly, it'd be better if they were united, but I'm not here to talk about potential unifications. I'm here to talk about effects of religions being different. See, the Hindus don't like the Muslims for a number of reasons, and neither do the Muslims like the Hindus. As a matter of fact, when they were first conquering into India, the Muslims would actually purge a lot of Hindus because they weren't of the book, so to speak. They didn't follow a monotheistic religion with sacred texts. Now, they were polytheistic and they did have the Vedic text, but I don't think the Muslims really cared that much when they were conquering. Eventually, of course, it led to numerous religious clashes, and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India now exist because of it. Simultaneously, there's also the obvious conflict of Israel and Palestine, which, initially just a matter of nationalistic land claims, has evolved into a religious conflict as the Muslim world supports Palestine and much of the Jewish and Christian world supports Israel. It's not one-to-one, but it has evolved and resulted in many, many bad feelings towards different religions and faiths. And then there's, of course, just general warring under religious justifications. Crusades, big example, but there are many conquests by many groups who followed the line of, your religion is not ours, we want you to adopt ours, therefore we shall conquer you. The Romans did this a lot, as did the Incas to a lesser extent with other faiths. It's just kind of a thing that people do. Quick justification and all that. So in the end, the best way I could say this is, let people have their faiths, but do not deny the differences in them. In other words, let church and state be separate. Let people have their faith. Let them speak in the halls of the state if necessary. But do not make the state enforce one religion. Do not let it declare one religion to be acceptable. Because in the end, for whatever justification someone may have for following a faith, maybe they like its doctrines, maybe they need a guide for morality, maybe they just followed it because that's what their parents followed. Whatever the justification, it doesn't really matter. It's their faith, not ours. And so long as they don't use it to justify, say, bombing someone, killing someone, invading the French. Actually, I wouldn't mind that one too much, but yeah. As long as they don't use it to justify anything too bad, it is acceptable. Let people have their faith, and let people, not kill each other over it. If they try, well, crush them. Simple as. And if they try to make law of anything in their faith, simple policy. If it isn't protected by the natural rights of the people, it shall not be done. Anyways, that's what I think. Apologies if the rant makes no sense. But have a good one, and see you later.